Naughty Dog, Square Enix, Ubisoft, Nintendo, Insomniac. What do all of these developers have in common? Well, I'm sure they have a lot of things in common, what with them all being massive AAA video game development studios that churn out remarkable pieces of art on an almost yearly basis. But the thing I want to highlight today is that a majority of these and other game devs, especially the ones that have been around since the boom of '87, have had a lot of time to perfect their design philosophy. Developers cut their teeth in early video game creation on new hardware and pioneered their own genres and design tropes. It's taken drastic shifts in direction and tone for them to create their magnum opuses, with many trials and tribulations to come in between. Before The Last of Us, there was Crash Bandicoot. Before Kingdom Hearts, there was Chrono Trigger. Before Assassin's Creed, there was Rayman. Before Spider-Man, there was Spyro. Before Super Mario, was Mario. Does Nintendo make any other games aside from Mario? Can somebody fact check that, please? Video games have never really had an inherent state of rules that they had to follow in order to create an effective product. From the beginning, you just kind of did stuff and hoped it worked out in the end. Video games aren't like movies or cartoons or even books. You can find a standard or skeletal framework that more or less finds its way into every passive form of entertainment. In 99% of movies, the protagonist will always follow through on bringing about the change of their narrative. In a book, you'll go through a tale spun by the author regarding whatever platform they're trying to push through their words. In a video game, however, the developer has to account for the people that end up interacting with their product. The operative word there being interact. A person engages with a video game. They test its boundaries, they get lost in its world. A player is dropped into a digital world and left to their own devices. And the developers can only hope that whatever they've constructed can be conveyed properly, mechanically, and narratively. Video games are also fundamentally difficult as a means of conveyance due to the fact that they rely heavily on the technical limitations provided at the time. Video games in 2020 look like they come from a different dimension when you compare them to what existed in the 1980s. If you went back in time with a PS5 and a copy of Elden Ring and showed it to the dev team working on the first Final Fantasy game, first of all, they'd probably think you were an alien or something and you'd be hunted by the government. But more importantly, you'd probably give a few game designers their eureka moments with how intense that comparison goes. Every time there's a jump in technology, the way a person's creative freedom can be expressed is also burst open wider than they ever imagined. Even with just the jump from 2D game design using pixel art and moving sprites to the simplistic low poly 3D models moving around in an open space gave way to new forms of expression and interactivity. Everything since that point has been technical engineers finding additional ways to just add more ways to design a product. How many polygons can we fit on a screen at a time? How many layers to a CD can we add to give it more space? Can we develop a form of ray tracing that doesn't make people's GPUs burst into flames? That last one is to be determined, but the rest of it has more or less been solved, for now. With this constant ebb and flow regarding technical limitations and the restrictions placed on art forms, I get taken back to an era when video game development and its possibilities really came into the public eye. A time where people stopped describing playing video games as a geeky fanboy's hobby, and generally more accepted as an entertainment platform that wasn't going to go away anytime soon. A point in humanity's history where entire public advertisement campaigns and research groups were formed specifically to target that audience of people. No longer did nerds have to hide behind their big framed glasses and pocket protectors. Being into video games was cool now, and Mountain Dew and Doritos were here to validate your opinions. I'm of course talking about the early 2000s. In 1997, a little-known game development studio responsible for real-time strategy series Myth and the revolutionary FPS series Marathon, known as Bungie, decided to expand and relocate their studio in Chicago to the sunny streets of San Jose, California, and established Bungie West. Founders Alex Seropian and Jason Jones set up this studio to begin work on a brand new project that they'd be able to fund, develop, and produce entirely by themselves. The success of their previous work gave them enough of a leg up in the industry to finally create things by themselves. To spearhead this project, they recruited a 3D software engineer from Apple named Brent Pease and put him in charge of the entirety of Bungie West. He immediately got to work to start making a brand new project with the goal of creating an entirely 3D environment and action-oriented gameplay. Pease took inspirations from Japan's rapidly rising anime industry, citing Mamoru Oshii's Ghost in the Shell as the biggest contributor. With a creative destination and new talent pouring in thanks to the 3D game design boom, Bungie West got to work on Project ONI, naming it after what Pease's girlfriend misread as the translation for Ghost in Japanese. However, it's here where a divergent twist of fate would ensue and a massive screw up of costly proportions would change Bungie's fate as a development studio forever. See, up until this point, Bungie as a whole was an independent game developer. They didn't answer to another company for deadlines, and they created all of their own tech and software. That also meant that they paid their own bills. After their main studio finished production of Myth 2, they shipped the game with a hybrid installer disc for Mac and Windows. This installation disc was needed in order to establish your license to the game and put the core game files on your PC. It's also what you used to uninstall your game when you decided you didn't want to play it anymore. But a major coding flaw was found on the installation disc after the game had already entered gold status and was shipped out to stores for release day. You see, if a person used the disc to install Myth 2 on their C drive, the main drive that a person uses regularly every day, and then uninstalled the game, the disc would execute the removal to the farthest extent that it possibly could. The program would delete the files for Myth 2, but a bug in the program's coding made the program forget where to stop as they removed files. This meant that the program would continually delete the person's C drive registry until that person's computer crashed, turning it into a literal brick. No more data, no more computer. Thankfully, Bungie found the bug within a few days of Myth 2 actually being put on store shelves for sale, but the recall they were forced to enact was massive, and unfortunately for them, expensive, reportedly costing over $1 million between the shipping, reprinting, and labor. For a small independent studio, at the time, Bungie wasn't able to take that cost and simply move on. In 1998, Bungie West was neck deep in the development on ONI, and their main office was hard at work creating Project Blam, which, for those of you who don't know, was the codename for the massively successful Halo Combat Evolved. Bungie needed to be able to pay its employees and make sure their bills for equipment and office space were paid, so they immediately had to do a bit of negotiating with larger companies to buy their assets and stocks to keep them afloat. They ended up settling on a deal with Take-Two Interactive, selling them a 20% stake in the company for development revenue. With this, Bungie was able to continue production on their games without having to lay off staff or destroy Bungie West just a year after being established. Everything seemed like an immense boon. Bungie could work, and Take-Two got a cut of their profits in return for investing in them. However, this also meant that Bungie had to report to Take-Two often and were given stricter deadlines than before. They couldn't necessarily push things back if they weren't ready, or spend money out of their budget if they needed to. They had someone to answer to now, so if there were problems, they were a lot bigger than they were before. And for Pease and his team, problems seemed to be all that they got. ONI was promised to the public and Take-Two Interactive to release in the holiday season of 1999. A small visual demo was shown to the public at E3 that year, showing a playable build, and Pease himself was there to show off the game at their stand. But behind the scenes, the game just didn't exist at all. Everything shown to the public and their shareholders was a complete fabrication. They had some rooms, some character models, and animations, but nothing was actually playable. There is no game in Bungie West. And with the year half gone, Bungie was beginning to sweat. They formed a new position at their sister studio and hired on a man named Hardy LaBelle to kickstart the project and hopefully bring some cohesiveness to the design staff and hopefully create an actual video game. They weren't able to meet their original deadline, as one would imagine. Nobody can code an entire 3D video game with only basic assets and animations in less than a year, so the goal was to finish and polish the game for the 2000 release to maximize sales. During this time, Bungie West entered the dreaded and often lamented part of video game development, crunch time. If they couldn't make this new release date, people would be fired, the company would be forced to close some of their offices, and potentially sell more of themselves to Take-Two. Brent Pease, the man that Bungie brought in to lead the project in the first place, was eventually fired as well, as his presence made progress on the game stall frequently, and he didn't work well with the new help Bungie injected into the studio to push production on ONI. During the year of 2000, Bungie was also approached by Microsoft, who had begun working on establishing their video game development branch. Multiple executives at Microsoft had expressed interest in hiring them as a studio to publish content on their in-production Xbox. And with their track record creating Myth and Marathon, Bungie administrators were thrilled at the thought of being able to produce creatively without having to worry about where their money is coming in from and having more freedom over their actual production. The only problem was that Take-Two still owned a portion of Bungie at this time, and so they entered a deal-making phase. Microsoft would buy out their shares in Bungie, allow them access to the engine that Project Blam was being worked on, the rights to the Myth franchise, and anything and everything related to ONI. They would create a hard deadline for the game, and once everything was wrapped up with ONI's development, they could wash their hands of it and be done. Take-Two was reluctant to say the least, but eventually agreed to the deal, as they had already sunk a decent amount of money into the studio and production of the game had already taken 2 years to this point. So the stage was set. Bungie West, now led by Hardy LaBelle and director Michael Evans, slammed all of their effort into finishing the game. It took many months of grueling and intense crunch, working many long hours, and probably breaking a few human rights violations to get the game done. In the end, Bungie West wasn't able to meet their holiday 2000 deadline. It came down to the wire, but in the end they had to completely cut out a multiplayer version of the game that they had promised since the beginning in order to ship anything at all. Take-Two also coordinated a joint venture with Rockstar Canada to create a PS2 port, but communications between all three parties broke down quickly and eventually led to Rockstar just taking the game files, putting it together haphazardly as quickly as they could, and releasing their port. Bungie West finished the Mac and PC version of the game to the best of their abilities and were able to publish it in January of 2001, and shortly thereafter closed their offices and merged with their sister studio, who had just relocated to Redmond, Washington, where Microsoft had set up some space for them. ONI reportedly sold less than 100,000 copies across all three platforms to mixed and negative reception, especially the PS2 version. Critics cited the level design, which had massive rooms but very plain textures and props, a lukewarm plot and underdeveloped enemy AI as their main complaints, with a rapid difficulty spike and lack of save points to top it all off. The missing multiplayer mode, which had been promised since day one, was also a major disappointment for players and reviewers alike, as it was the main pull to get people gaming on PC during its press releases and convention panels. ONI had less than a year to make regular sales as well, as Microsoft completed work on their console and Bungie's main studio had finished development on their debut entry as part of Microsoft's banner, Halo, which released simultaneously on November 15th, 2001 for PC and Xbox. As a result of Halo's instant success, ONI seems to have been forgotten by time as a casual blip on gaming history's radar. Sure, it's not the most technically impressive game for the PS2, even when compared to other titles that came out that year like Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, Jak and Daxter the Precursor Legacy, and hell, even Grand Theft Auto 3. But as I've gone through my library, pursuing content about niche games and hidden stories about video games and their history, there's something really novel about ONI that I just had to share. This story about its development staff and its creation, the battle for Bungie between Take-Two and Microsoft, and the tale being told within the game itself, all harken back to that era of video game design where trails hadn't been blazed yet. The world of 3D game design had just started to reveal itself. Technical limitations were being broken every single day, and influences from around the world made their way into everybody's work unashamedly. This game, ONI, despite its many glaring flaws, is a great example of the stumbling and force of will it took to make a video game in this era. If not as a rubric for what makes for fantastic game design, then maybe as a mistake we can look back on, recognize our failures and shortcomings, and strive to make something better by. ONI is a story-driven third-person beat-em-up game where you solve simple navigation puzzles and basic platforming while engaging in gunfights and hand-to-hand combat with enemy soldiers as you proceed. You play as a woman named Kanoko, who's been recruited by the Technological Crimes Task Force, or TCTF, to investigate and apprehend criminals in a dystopian future where a climate crisis has poisoned the Earth's atmosphere, rendering a great portion of the world uninhabitable. Working against the TCTF is a global force known as the Syndicate, an organization pursuing technological freedom and using an any means necessary approach to accomplish their goals. Kanoko will punch, kick, and shoot her way through 14 chapters of dispatching Syndicate forces, uncovering corporate conspiracies, and navigating her true heritage kept from her entire life. It's up to the player to decide what kind of life Kanoko will follow by the end of the game. The main focus in the moment-to-moment gameplay in ONI is the thrilling combat sequences. Interwoven with the regular shootouts in the game are these brutal hand-to-hand fighting sessions where the player is stacked against one or more criminals to take down. Kanoko can chain together punch and kick attacks to create combo moves that stun foes and deal massive damage when executed successfully. When an enemy is struck, they're shown a colored flash to correlate how high their HP is. Green is good, yellow is fair, orange is bad, red is critical. Enemies are finished off with a colorful red and white flash and a pretty intense sound effect. Kanoko is given one of these as well whenever she's struck, and I'm not entirely sure if that has anything to do with how hard the enemy AI chases you down, but it's worth mentioning as there are a few times where the player can see their flash appear at the same time they strike an enemy, making for a somewhat confusing time. This is especially apparent when you're in a group fight versus a few enemies, and there's just this flashing going on all over the screen. I'm a big fan of particle effects during combat, so this wasn't bothersome for me, but I can see why this would be a pain for some people. Combo attacks themselves are fairly easy to work out as well. Since you can only use your punches and kicks to damage enemies, you can basically trial and error your way through your own moveset in a decent amount of time. You can also just strike the air and figure out your combos without actually having to test them in combat, so that's a plus. As you proceed through the game, you'll unlock additional moves that reach into the depths of your movement mechanics, as well as to deal damage in unique ways. Running toward enemies and hitting the punch or kick buttons will throw your opponent in the direction you were running, or enter a crazy grapple move that just snaps the dude's fucking neck. Yikes. Using the crouch command in the middle of combat is also pretty good, as it allows you to attack your enemies and knock them off balance, or break through a block, allowing for more opportunities to actually land hits. There's also a few area of effect moves that can be done while moving into or out of a crouch, letting you better take on enemies when you're surrounded. The guns are also worth your time in this game as well, as they can be excellent ways to thin herds, distract certain enemies, or whittle away some health on a boss enemy or big fella giving you a hard time. There's a total of 10 different guns in the game, separated into 2 categories of ballistic guns and energy weapons. The ballistic guns use traditional bullets and take the form of pistols, SMGs, rocket launchers, and a mercury-fueled sniper rifle. Energy weapons use plasma as ammunition and range from rifles that shoot blobs, to a shock pistol that stuns foes, to a cannon that shoots an ephemeral being that drains the life force out of organisms within a certain proximity to itself. However, ammunition in this game is incredibly scarce. For how some big of these rooms can get, very rarely will there be a pickup of some kind in it that allows you to carry the same gun for a long time, so you'll revert to fist fights often. If there's one thing I can hand to this game for sure, it's the commitment to a decent vocal performance. Despite how lifeless some of these character models look, the voice cast is particularly helpful in communicating the emotion each person is feeling at a given moment. Amanda Wynn Lee, the voice actress for the main character Kanoko, is capable of changing her tone on the fly from one of gritty angst to that of wallowing pity. In a scene where she's angry at the world, her shift to a lower octave is creepy and almost intimidating. Yet she's entirely capable of putting on the feminine charm, talking out of vulnerability or perhaps innocence when she's letting her guard down. This translates well to her combat voice clips as well, as her callouts for her signature moves, the grunts and cries of pain she emits when struck, are all particularly visceral. Fun fact, Amanda was also the voice actress for Kurutan in the English dub of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, which is the franchise that original design lead Brent Pease took inspiration from to make ONI in the first place. I just thought that was neat. Pete Stacker voiced Kanoko's direct supervisor, Commander Griffin. He's got that typical "I'm your superior, obey me or you're off the case" attitude. His threatening demeanor comes across well, and you can tell that he's likely seen some terrible things in his heyday. Anne Bowerman brought an innocent girl voice to the portrayal of Shinatama, an android directly linked with Kanoko to keep track of her physiology throughout her missions. There's a part of the game where Shinatama is kidnapped, interrogated, and tortured, and the game does not skip out on any of those scenes. Hearing her scream in agony and whimper for help is incredibly difficult and is delivered too well by Anne. Kurt Nabig is probably the only one of the bunch that I can point to and wish there was more coming out of that performance. Muro does a lot of running away in this game. Most of the scenes where he's involved is him just barely slipping from the TCTF's grasp, so a lot of the lines he has are just him making offhanded remarks about Kanoko and how he wants her killed. Dumb little taunts as he turns to run away as if he has anything better to be doing. This likely has more to do with the script Kurt was given and not his actual tone, which I will admit is quite menacing. The world which these characters live in is also pretty impressive as well. Dystopian futures is probably a concept that's seen its fair share of wear and tear by now, but I'll always go back to these kinds of stories where things are just about at their lowest. The future ONI takes place in is probably just 1 or 2 steps away from being a total apocalyptic scenario. The atmosphere here is filthy, toxic to life, and is only being staved off by facilities across the world that pump in air and push it back out after an intense filtration process. But the public in this game just isn't told any of that stuff. They don't get to see behind the curtain. They're only told what the governments of the world want them to know. As far as the general populace knows, the limitations on where people are allowed to travel are all made because they've been dubbed as wilderness preserves. Humanity stretched too far one day, and now the governments of the world have established the boundaries of where people can and cannot be. And because humanity has sustained such intense setbacks and massive infighting with criminal doings, they kind of just go along with that. Some don't, but most do. And the greatest part about this entire story, none of it is told directly to the player at all. There's no setup cutscene that describes the world's status to you. There's no info dump by an NPC between missions or anything like that. You can go the majority of this game without knowing any of that information until the game brings it up directly in the chapter where Kanoko finds out more about her past. The bulk of this game's lore and story content is told to us through these data consoles throughout each mission area. Kanoko will visit research facilities, government buildings, and TCTF outposts multiple times in this game, and each one of them contains these consoles with pages of information describing the goings-on of the world around her. Technological experiments being performed by biological research companies, seizure of illegal weapons and technology by the TCTF and world governments, and even the state of the world's atmosphere and its progression across the globe. The main story here only gets the player invested in Kanoko's story as they play, allowing for people to be as interested as they want to without bloating the game with unnecessary information. Of course, it's all entirely there if the player wants to seek it out. The game tells the player in the tutorial that the consoles with green data on screen contain additional information should they want it. In my opinion, I think this is a wonderful way to enrich the player's perception of the game without demanding that they know every little tidbit and every facet of knowledge about the world the game takes place in. However, everything's not so sunshine and rainbows. In this game about espionage, betrayal, and biological warfare, ONI shows very quickly that it isn't a perfect game. Far from it. This game struggles with balancing the good core gameplay and story setup with the graphical fidelity and game design that had become industry standard by this time. This game just looks bad. Now, I know that may seem like a crooked statement, but this gameplay you're seeing right now has been given the makeover treatment by a community effort known as ONI Anniversary Edition, a PC mod that took the core game files apart and allowed for mods to be installed of varying degrees. This includes new characters, weapons, additional levels, but more importantly, texture and model upgrades. This is the opening sequence of the first level with the mods installed. This is the version of the game that runs standard on PCs. See the difference? It's actually kind of scary when I look at them side by side like this. To put this in perspective, this game was in production after the technological specs for the PS2 were sent out across the world. By the year 2000, the PS2 was already out in Japan, and games for it even then look much better than this. To me, the voice acting and smooth as butter gameplay movement absolutely carry this game because this just looks bad. Along with the bad models go the rooms and level appearances in general. This game is just not detailed. Like, this is supposed to be a scientist's laboratory, and there's the single row of computers in it with no screens or functioning at all. You walk into this room in a warehouse and it's completely empty save for like 6 barrels spread out in their groups of 3. You have a massive room with cargo to be loaded into shipping containers and trucks, but there's only like 2 trucks, and the containers are all closed. There's no labels or logos on any of them. It's just very plain. ONI has a lot of rooms where things are either squares or slopes. Even the rooftops, which you would think have interesting structures and architecture, are just giant rectangles with graded balconies and the same untouched HVAC units across every single one of them. Some of the environments have nice details, like this chemical vat room that actually has arcs of electricity shooting across them. They thought to put the decals of where the lightning strikes on the floors and walls, giving an indication that the problem has persisted for a while still. But these little details are few and far between, and the world just feels so flat and boring. The worst part has to be this game's idea of puzzles and difficulty though. On several missions, Kanoko has to infiltrate a facility of some kind and weave her way past security in order to accomplish her objectives. This involves finding security consoles that unlock certain color-keyed doors to progress forward. Oftentimes, these consoles consoles are hidden behind a chain of other locked doors, and the consoles that unlock those doors are in obscure places out of sight and far away, even on separate floors altogether. This is instantly apparent in the second level, where the Syndicate has laid a trap for Kanoko's arrival. All of the doors in the facility are locked, and the player will have to fight through rooms of enemies in order to find the correct sequence of consoles to hit that let them farther into the facility. Check out this one part where I unlocked the door to the final boss, but the door that opened is on the other side of the facility, so I have to go back to the very beginning of the level, weave my way through hallways completely void of enemies, bombing in and out of doors to get back to the middle of the complex and find the door that I need. Why was it so complicated to get here? Why not put the door outside the room I just got into? Why not put it at the beginning, since this entire level loops in on itself? Why does this all have to be so far out of the way? The enemy encounters in this game also aren't entirely off the hook either. I said earlier that the combat in this game was fun and smooth, and I still stand by that. Sessions where you're absolutely destroying the Syndicate and TCTF troops are a fucking blast, and I enjoy taking on two dudes at the same time and just wrecking them. The problem is that that's the exception really, not the rule. More often than not, combat encounters in this game are just completely unfair. Unless you're approaching an encounter of 2 or more enemies on green health with 2 or more health restoration items, the game will wreck your shit and not feel bad about it. See, there's no designated block button. In order to block attacks, the player has to be standing completely still, not pressing a single button, and facing the enemy that's attacking you head on. So if you jump in the middle of 3 dudes after wailing on them for a bit, each of them, and I mean each of them, can strike you at the same time. This leads to moments where you'll have just cleared a room of guys with no problem to entering another, and through a misclick or maybe just bad luck, get ganged up on and ruined. And due to the scarcity of health item and ammunition pickups across each level, you'll find yourself stuck in 20-minute sessions trying to clear the same group of 10 or 12 enemies before making it to the next checkpoint, like I did here in this part of the final level, where I entered with less than half health and no additional ammo for my weapon. This was just painful. Utterly painful. I think video games didn't have a standardization of what makes for good game design until well into the 2000s, when gaming really hit the mainstream and public eye deemed it as a worthy form of art. When more people get to play your games, a general rule set of what made it good in the first place gets established and that legacy is passed on. Leave it to games like Metroid and Castlevania being so well liked to form their own genre based on the things that people liked about those games. The same can be said for Mario and its basic platforming techniques. JRPGs were thrust into the spotlight when Final Fantasy reached America, and now, turn-based role-playing games with random encounters are considered classics. ONI, with its troubled development and lackluster main gameplay, is probably the ultimate example of a mistake when you judge it by these standards. Beat-em-up games to this point had intricate combo systems to be sure, and there's some of that in ONI's gameplay, but those games had interesting set design and fun replayability to them. You can play a fighting game for hours and hours and not get bored, but after playing ONI twice for this video, I can happily say that I won't be picking it up anytime soon for another trip to the TCTF headquarters. But the important thing about a mistake is that you can learn from them, and I think Bungie made the most of the experiences it learned through this process. Having a clear and concise roadmap for production, not letting the art direction take the entire lead on your project, and creating a game specifically to work like a game from the beginning were all valuable lessons to be learned here. There are some wonderful inspired moves for this game, and you can see the soul of the staff from Bungie West within this game. A beating heart of passion and creativity, shrouded in a veil of corporate demands and misplaced anguish. ONI is now barely kept alive purely through the online community effort, and while a sequel was in the early stages of development after the first was published, it was cancelled quickly and quietly, never to be spoken of again. These days, Bungie is hard at work on their massively popular Destiny franchise, but before there was Destiny, Bungie was known for the now forgotten Project ONI. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to be awesome and be kind and rewind. Have a wonderful evening. Excelsior.